Okay, so once again, just to put it on tape, that we are recording this lecture and the recording will be put up on the public web. So we begin today's lecture. So today's topic is going to be the strong law of large numbers. So remember the question we started off with, saying that is it going to be the case that the proportion of tosses in an infinite sequence of coins is going to be half, and we said that it will not always be half because you'll have cases like all the tosses being heads and so on. So it will be half only in a probabilistic sense, and today we are going to calculate the probability that the proportion of tosses is actually half. So this statement that we'll find that the probability that the proportion of tosses is actually half in the limit is the probability of that is exactly going to be equal to 1. And that's a special case of a very important theorem in probability theory known as the strong law of large numbers. So here and in the rest of this lecture, I am going to actually violate the logical ordering a bit, because so far I have not defined in the setup of measure theory what is a random variable, what is the expectation of a random variable. All of that we are going to do in our next lecture. So the reason for doing this today is that we have developed some apparatus in the previous lectures. So I wanted to show you a use of that as soon as possible. So and there will be no essentially logical problem, because all the random variables we deal with are going to be defined on only a finite number of coin tosses. So they are part of the elementary probability theory that I assume we already know. So strictly speaking, there is no logical problem, though there may appear to be one because expectations and so on are not defined. Okay. So this is the statement in the general case. The theorem that you see above is the statement in the general case of the strong law of large numbers. It says that if you have a sequence of independent, identically distributed random variables whose mean exists, right? So there is no guarantee that random variable will have a mean. So we assume the only thing we assume about the sequence of random variables is that they are independent, they are identically distributed, and their mean exists and is equal to some number mu. Then there is a set with probability 1, the set A, such that for every outcome in A, the sample average x1 to xn divided by n tends to mu. So just like in the coin toss case, we cannot really say that it will always tend to mu. Right? Things may happen because all things are possible. They are independent. So each toss or each outcome of the random variable doesn't know what the others are doing. So it may happen that the average goes away somewhere. But because exactly that they are independent, they cannot conspire to make this happen consistently. And so the probability that this will happen, that it will just run away somewhere, is zero. And with probability 1, the sample averages will actually converge to the mathematical expectation of each of these random variables. Right? And the reason the infinite coin toss example is a special case is that if you define xi to be 1 when the ith toss is heads and it to be 0 when the ith toss is tails, then the average, sample average is just the proportion of heads, right? Because when you add x1 to xn, you are adding 1 for each time it is heads and you are adding 0 for each time it is tails. So the total in the numerator is the number of heads. You are dividing by the total number of tosses. So what you are going to get is the proportion of tosses. So therefore, to say that the proportion of tosses goes to half is the same thing as saying that the law of is the same result that you get by applying the strong law of large numbers to the infinite coin toss example. So is this okay? Are there any questions on this? Okay. So why is the strong law of large number important? So there are two good things about it. Firstly, that the limit is much simpler than the things which go into the limit. So the things which are going into the limit are random variables, but the limit is just a number, mu. So mu is just a real number. It is not a random object. So you average lot of random objects, and in this case, you get something which is not random at all. So this is happening because each of the contributions are independent, right? So the fluctuations are averaging out. Something is high, something is low, the fluctuations are average. That happens because each of the component is independent and each one of them has smaller and smaller weightage. So you're dividing by n. So as you take more and more things, each one is getting a smaller weightage, and you are getting divided by n, and you are getting a averaging out of the fluctuations, and you are getting something non-random as a result. So the limit is much simpler to talk about than the things which are going into the limit. So that is the first thing. So if you are interested in the aggregate behavior, so one way to think of this that people talk about is that we have a macro versus micro situation, that each xi is a micro, right? And you're adding it up and you're getting some kind of macro, right? So one of the early cases where people try to apply law of large numbers, I was reading this very classic book on money and prices by Wixel, right? It's called Interest and Prices. And at that time, the law of large numbers was a kind of new mathematical result. So Wixel actually has an appendix in which he tries to prove the law of large numbers. Why? Because again, he's thinking of banks, that a lot of people are going to go and withdraw money from banks. So each person's decision, whether they are going to withdraw the money or not, is the micro decision. And there's a lot of randomness. You may need the money, you may not need the money. But if you have a lot of borrowers, and importantly, if their needs are independent, then you can say that the bank has a very good idea of how much money will be withdrawn each day, right? If they're not independent, if there's a bank run, then of course everything goes haywire. But if they're independent, you are withdrawing money because of personal needs. So then whether I have a personal need now may be uncorrelated with whether you have a personal need now. And then you can apply the law of large numbers and say that the demand of withdrawals from the bank is going to be simple and highly predictable, even though each individual depositor's requirements are very unpredictable. So one good thing about the things like law of large numbers is that the limit is simple. The second good thing is that the limit is universal. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you see the limit here, the limit mu depends only on the mathematical expectation of xi and not on the distributions at all. So the xi may have any old distribution. As long as the mean exists, the sample averages will converge to the mean regardless of what the distribution is. So a lot of the variability, a lot of the diversity in the micro level gets ironed out at the macro level. So this is valuable because we may not have full information about the micro. So if you ask me, exactly what is the probability distribution of people's need to withdraw money from banks, then I may not exactly know what the distribution is. But I know that whatever it is, as long as I have enough confidence that it has a mean, the sample average will converge to the mean. Right? So therefore, in deriving the macro predictions, I need not have full information about the micro. So that in that sense, it is universal. That all kinds of distribution, when you take the sample average, the mean is described in the same way. This is important. I think many of us do econometrics. So in econometrics, often you have properties about what happens to estimators. And as long as you are happy with a limit result, as long as you are happy with a large sample result, you don't have to care about what the distribution of the errors is. Right? So if you have a finite, know the properties of the, say, the beta hat, I need to know exactly what the distribution is, and you have to assume, for example, that the distribution is normal. But if you are interested only in what happens as the sample size goes to infinity, then you need not assume anything about the distribution of the errors, apart from saying things like it actually has to have a mean. Maybe sometimes you assume it has to have a variance. So you assume very few things about the distribution, and you get results which don't depend upon the distribution of the error terms at all. So again, you get a universal result. And the importance of that is the same as before, that I really don't know what the error distribution is. And so I want results which do not depend in a very sensitive way on what the error distribution is. Right? So that's again a good thing about the law of large numbers. And in fact, we keep using law of large numbers a lot in statistics and econometrics precisely for this reason. But there's a bad thing. And bad thing, of course, Keynes said this, that in the long run, we are all dead. So the theorem holds only when n tends to infinity. Okay. But in any real life situation, you are dealing with some n, right? And what does this theorem tell you about any particular n? It tells you nothing, right? It says that ultimately the sample average will be close to mu. But ultimately, is the approximation going to be good soon enough? Or is it going to be good enough soon enough, right? So we are saying that if you take some epsilon, then, and you say that it will be within epsilon distance of mu for some n. Okay. But how big is that n? So there's some capital N such that for all small n bigger than capital N, it's no more than epsilon away from mu. But how big is that big N is something that you need to know in order to apply results like this. Right? Otherwise, this result is useless. It's like saying that, okay, sometimes it will happen, but when will it happen? So there's a great deal of fun we have. It's unfair maybe that you have this all large sample results in econometrics. So sometimes you ask people, okay, when can you apply? And I don't know where this comes from, but invariably a lot of people will say when n is bigger than 30. I don't know who invented that 30. Okay, so n is bigger than 30, but how do you know? Right? You don't know. The theorem only says that as n tends to infinity, it will hold. But is 30 good enough? Is 300 good enough? Or do you need 3000? The theorem does not give you any guidance at all. And therefore, while these theorems like law of large number and other theorems which apply when n goes to infinity, we call them asymptotic results, they are useful as a starting point. At least they tell you that where it is going, and as it becomes larger, they are really not enough. We need to have some control of what happens for finite values of n. And therefore, in the early days of probability and statistics, while a lot of the attention was on asymptotic results like this, nowadays we spend also a lot of time thinking about non-asymptotic results, that actually getting error bounds for particular values of n. That okay, if I want my sample average to be within say 10% of mu, then how big a sample do I have to take? At least get a bound on that. You may not get the exact answer, but you say okay, take n this large, and you are guaranteed that it will be less than epsilon. Okay? So some of the techniques that we look at today is useful in that context too. So we should not get caught up entirely in these asymptotic results, but also think of getting good bounds for finite n. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. So now we start proving. So the general strong law of large number. Okay, another thing. Why the strong law? Because this convergence, that it converges to mu for a set of probability 1 is one of the many types of convergence we consider. So for convergence of random variables, there are other definitions. And if you define convergence in those terms, then you get different law of large numbers. So for example, towards the end of the lecture, we will see something known as the weak law of large numbers and so on. So there is no unique law of large numbers because there is no unique useful concept of convergence for random variables. There are many concepts, and different concepts will lead to different kind of laws. So the strong law applies when you are talking about convergence on a set of measure 1 or on a set of probability 1. Okay, so this is a slide actually from our first lecture. So just to remind you about how we are going to model this convergence. So to say that Qn is the proportion of heads. So Qn converges to half says that for any k, there is a big N such that for all small n greater than equal to big N, we have Qn omega minus half is less than 1 by k. So 1 by k is like a tolerance parameter. How big, how far away Qn omega can be from half. And we are saying that there is a big N such that for all small n greater than equal to big N, Qn omega is less than 1 by k distance away from half. Right? So any k you give me. So if you give me a bigger k, then the requirement becomes stronger. Then it cannot be very far away from half. But we are saying that however big a k you give me, there is a capital N such that for all small n bigger than capital N, Qn omega minus half is going to be less than 1 by k. And now that statement above we converted into set theoretic terms. So when you say all small n greater than n, you take a intersection. So you say that, okay, it's true for all small n. So only those omega which are there in this set for every n greater than capital N, take those. Then you say there exists some n, big N. So now you have a union. Because you say, okay, there is in some n. So when you say that element belongs to one of a collection of sets, you're talking about a union. Then again you have a for all. So for every k, so then you have an intersection. Remember from first lecture that the standard definition of limits you would have said less than epsilon, but we made it less than 1 by k, and we said that that's enough. But the reason we did 1 by k is that then this intersection is countable. So now we know that in measure theory, theorems apply to countable sequences and countable unions and countable intersections, and not for arbitrary unions and intersections. So we had to reframe the limit definition in a way such that in the interesting set, we have a countable unions and countable intersections and not arbitrary unions and intersections. That's why instead of epsilon, we chose just 1 by k, and we said that, okay, for any epsilon you take a large enough k, 1 by k is going to be less than epsilon, and so the standard definition of limit is going to be satisfied. Okay. So we now want to calculate the probability of G, the good set, where the proportion of heads converges to half. But we will find it easier to calculate the probability of G complement, the kind of bad set where the limit is not half, right? And here we have used De Morgan's laws to write G complement. So remember, in De Morgan's law, unions become intersections, intersection become union. So we apply that repeatedly. So this intersection becomes a union below. Then the second union becomes an intersection. The third intersection becomes a union. And the inside set is complemented. So instead of saying Qn omega minus half absolute value is less than 1 by k, we say Qn minus omega half absolute value is greater than equal to 1 by k. And we want to show that the probability of G complement is 0. Okay. So we want to show that the probability of this big set is 0. Any questions? Okay, so how do we go about doing that? So this is our plan. So plan will come in a number of slides. So the first step is of the plan is to name things. So AKN is the innermost set. Then when you take the union over all n, that becomes BK big N. And then CK is the intersection, and G complement then becomes the union. So I've done nothing but to name each of these levels so that I can write things easier. So it's just notation. Right? The plan is this. So the first step in the plan is that if you look at this BK big N, so it is the union from big N to infinity of AK small n. So now if you think of BK n plus 1, so you take the union from, say, first you're taking the union from small n is equal to 10 to infinity. Now you are taking the union from small n is equal to 11 to infinity. So the 11 onwards set, A sets, were already there. So basically you are taking a union over a smaller collection. So the result will be a subset of the union over the bigger collection, right? So BK n plus 1 means take the union from, say, n plus 1 onwards. Whereas BK n says take the union from n onwards. So taking the union from n plus 1 onwards will give you a fewer elements than taking the union from n onwards. So BK n plus 1 is a subset of BK n plus 2 is a subset of BK n plus 1, and so on. So now I have a decreasing sequence of sets. If you think of BKn as you hold k constant and you vary n, then you are looking at smaller and smaller and smaller sets. So it's a monotonically decreasing sequence of sets. So the continuity property of measures. So now we are starting to use the ideas that we have picked up about general measures. So the continuity property of measures tells you that the probability of CK, which is the intersection of all the BKN, right? So you are BKN is a sequence which is coming down from above. CK is the smallest possible set. So we are saying that the probability of this intersection set is going to be the limit of these probabilities, right? We can take this precisely because this is a decreasing sequence of sets. So CK is like the limit of these sets, that it is all the elements which belong to each BKN, right? So they're becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's a kernel in the center which is there everywhere, and that is CK. And we are saying that the probability attached to this kernel is the limit of this probability of the shells which are closing in, right? So if I can show that the limit of BKN is 0, then I know that the probability of CK is also 0, right? Okay. So what I will do is I will calculate the probability of BKN, or I will estimate it, and I will try to show that it is converging to 0. And then I will use continuity from above to say that therefore the probability of CK must also be 0 for any k. So long the k's are taken as constant. So for any k, I will show that the shells converge to a probability 0. So the probability of the thing in the center is also 0. Right? One thing we have to be careful about, that in the situations like this, probability 0 doesn't mean empty set, right? Non-empty sets can also have probability 0. So for example, each individual sequence of infinite coin tosses has a probability 0. So that's not an empty set, but that has probability 0. So we'll have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we'll have probability 0 sets which are not empty. So this kernel ck which is left in the center may not be empty set, but it has probability 0. Then G complement is the union of all the ck's over k. So the ck's may not be disjoint, right? So we have no reason to say that the ck's are disjoint. So we cannot say that the probability of G complement is the sum of the probabilities of the ck. But even if they're not disjoint, the countable subadditivity holds. So the probability of G complement is less than or equal to the sum of the probabilities of ck. Now, if we have proved in the previous step that the probability of ck is 0 for each, then the sum is also 0. So then the probability of G complement is less than or equal to 0. But because it's a probability, it has to be also greater than or equal to 0. So we will get probability of G complement is equal to 0. Right? So then, if we prove that the probability of these B's goes to 0, right, then we'll prove our final result that the probability of G complement is 0. So now our task becomes to prove that the probability of each of these B's actually goes to 0. So to understand the probability of B, each B is the union of the A's. So now we go to the probability of the A's. So we say that see B is a union of each of these A's. So again you apply countable subadditivity and you say the probability of B is less than or equal to the sum of the probability of the A's. This is sometimes given the name of the union bound, that if a set is the union of various sets, then the probability of that set or the measure of that set is less than or equal to the sum of the probability of the sets it's a union of. Right? That's just subadditivity. Now this union bound in a way can be wasteful because the right hand side may have a lot of double counting if the sets are not disjoint, right? So sometimes union bound may not be precise enough. So it's always true because subadditivity is always true, but the right hand side may be so enormous that it really gives you no information about the left hand side. Right? So the union bound is just the first thing we can do. But turns out that in this problem, the union bound is going to be enough. That the right hand side, even though it may have a lot of double counting, will actually have a precise enough upper bound on the left hand side that we can prove our theorem. Okay. So if you can add up the probability of akn and show that as n goes to infinity, this adding up is going to, then we'll show that the probability of bkn is going to 0. Right. Now akn is just about the first n tosses. That the proportion of heads in the first n tosses does not differ by more than 1 by k from half. Right? So as I said that the first n tosses, the number of heads is just a binomial probability distribution. So it's actually nothing complicated. But again, we don't want to apply the formula and calculate. That's a mess. So what we do is we want to estimate. So this is again a general point that at this, as you try to deal with harder and harder problems in analysis, calculating things exactly becomes less and less useful. So most of the time you try to get simple estimates rather than calculate a complicated quantity. So what we want to do is, instead of calculating the probability of akn exactly, we want to find an upper bound, because see, ultimately we are trying to prove that something is 0, right? And the bkn will limit to 0. So if you can put an upper bound that's going to be 0, then you think which is bounded is also going to go to 0. So you want to find the upper bound of akn by an, some number an, some sequence of numbers an, such that this sequence of numbers has a finite sum. So the sum from n is equal to 1 to infinity of an is less than infinity. Because if it is a finite sum, then the tail of the sequence, the sum from some big n to infinity, is going to contribute smaller and smaller, right? Because otherwise the sequence would not have converged, right? So if you can find upper bounds on akn of the type an such that the sum converges of this an, then the tail sum is going to go to 0. And the bkn probability, if you just look at the topmost equation here, the bkn probability is the tail sum of the probabilities of akn, which is bounded by the tail sum of an. And if you have been able to generate an an whose tail sums go to 0, then you know that the limit the limit that we need here, the limit as capital N goes to infinity, p bkn goes to 0, that will happen, right? So what are the steps? Ck by upper continuity is a limit of the bkn as n goes to 0. Bkn we have bounded above using the union bound by the tail sum of akn. Akn we are going to bound above, hopefully, by a sequence of numbers an whose tail sums converge to 0. So you can see that these estimates are kind of cascading. So you have a estimate an whose tail sums goes to 0, that bounds akn, that bounds bkn, and ultimately we will be able to show that the limit that bkn goes to 0. So of course our main job is left, that we have to find some of these numbers an which can bound the probabilities of akn and which converge to 0. Okay. So any questions here? Okay. So now we go for a search for these an. So the tool we use, okay, just a second. So before we go to the tool, basically defined in terms of the event proportion of heads, but this proportion of heads comes from the sum of each one being head or not. So rather than dealing with the set, it is easier if we deal with random variables. So I will define a few auxiliary variables. So ri omega is plus 1 if the ith toss is heads, minus 1 if the ith toss is tails. Remember, when I was describing the law of large numbers, we had something like dummy variables, 1 or 0. But this plus 1 minus 1 encoding is better because the expected value will be 0. So you don't have to keep subtracting the expected value. So if you say it's plus 1 with probability half, minus 1 with probability half, so its expectation is 0. Then Sn I define as the sum of Ri from I is equal to 1 to n. So Sn is every heads will contribute plus 1, every tails will contribute minus 1. So Sn is nothing but the number of heads minus the number of tails. So you do a little bit of algebra, you get that the number of heads is Sn plus n by 2. So the proportion of heads, number of heads by n, is Sn by n plus half, right? So Sn is actually capturing somehow like the deviation from the expected number of the actual number of heads, right? Sn by n. So the expected number is half, the deviation is Sn by n. And so we have to kind of bound Sn. So our bound is Qn minus half is greater than 1 by k, but Qn is Sn by n plus half. So Qn minus half is going to be just mod Sn. So we have to say mod Sn is greater than equal to n by k. Right? So we have to find upper bounds on the probability of Sn being too large. So that is the goal we have. Questions?
Can you repeat deviation wala part?
Yeah. So I'm saying that if you define Sn, so this one is just arithmetic, that I define Ri to be plus 1 if the toss is heads, minus 1 if the toss is tails. But when you do a little bit of this rearrangement, you say that the proportion of heads, which is Qn, number of heads by n, is Sn by n plus half. So the limit that we are aiming for in a law of large numbers is that the proportion of n heads will go to half. So we say that in any actual experiment, any actual sequence of tosses, the proportion of heads is half plus a kind of error, which is Sn by n. So now we want to upper bound the magnitude of this error. So we are going to say that the probability that this error is large is going to be a small probability. So the innermost sets AKN that we are looking at is where Qn minus half is greater than 1 by k. But if you make the substitution that Qn is Sn by n plus half, it just says that Sn by n is greater than 1 by k, which is to say that Sn is greater than n by k. So AKN, the sets whose probabilities we need to bound by a number which is sums up to something less than infinity, is the probability that this Sn omega is not too large. It's not larger than n by k. So the probability that Sn omega is greater than equal to n by k, we want to show that it has a small probability. Is that okay? Okay. Okay, so how do we do that? So again, we use a general tool for that, which is known as the Markov inequality, which says that if x is a non-negative random variable, then for any lambda, the probability that x is greater than equal to lambda is less than equal to the mathematical expectation of x divided by lambda. So basically, it gives you a bound on x being large in terms of its mathematical expectation. So of course, it is useful only when x has a finite expectation. If x has expectation infinity, then the right hand side is infinite, which is again something true but useless. But if ex is finite, then this actually says that as lambda becomes larger and larger, you can see that the right hand side is going to become smaller and smaller. So it tells you that if the random variable has a finite expectation, then as lambda becomes larger, the probability of x being greater than lambda is going to become smaller. So this works only for non-negative random variables, but it gives you a very easy to use upper bound on the random variable being large. Right? Because for a lot of this convergence kind of behavior, we want to limit the probability that the random variable is too large. Okay? Because that's how you'll get convergence. If it always is large, then you'll not get convergence. So to bound it, one of the standard tools is the Markov inequality. The proof goes like this. So you can write x as x times 1a and 1a complement. So 1a is the indicator variable. It is true if the omega is in a, and it is false if the omega is not in a, right? And 1a complement is exactly the same thing for a complement. It is 1 if omega is in a complement, and 0 if omega is not in a complement. So what is the value 1a plus 1a complement? It is something which is always 1, right? Because if omega is in a, then the first term 1a is 1 and 1a complement is 0. On the other hand, if omega is in a complement, then 1a complement is 1 and 1a is 0. So 1a plus 1a complement is always exactly equal to 1. So there is no harm in saying that x is equal to x times 1a plus x times 1a complement. Okay. So now you take the mathematical expectation of both sides, and you use the fact that mathematical expectations is linear, so it just adds up. So the mathematical expectation of x is mathematical expectation of x times 1a plus the mathematical expectation of x times 1a complement. Now x times 1a complement is non-negative because x is non-negative by assumption, by the hypothesis of the theorem, and 1a complement is either 1 or 0, so it's not going to change the sign. So x times 1a complement is non-negative, so its expectation is also non-negative, right? So therefore this number is larger than if you take the expectation of just the first term, right? So that's where the first inequality is coming from, that the sum of the two expectation is greater than equal to the sum of just the first expectation, because the first expectation is the second expectation is always a non-negative number. What about the second inequality? The second inequality is coming from the fact that 1a is non-zero only when you are in a, but a is the event that x is greater than equal to lambda. So everywhere where this is not 0, x is greater than lambda, so the expectation will be greater if you just replace x by lambda, right? Because x is more than lambda. So the lambda, if you put lambda, then the x times 1a is always going to be greater than equal to lambda times 1a. Because when you are not in a, both are 0. When you are in a, then 1a is 1 and x is greater than lambda. So the second inequality comes. Now the lambda is a constant, so I can take it outside the expectation. So it becomes lambda expectation of 1a. But what is the expectation of 1a? Well, 1a is 1 when you are in a, so it's 1 times probability of a, plus it is 0 when you are not in a, so it's 0 times probability of a complement. But that's a 0, so that doesn't contribute anything. So you get lambda times the probability of a. So if you chain together everything, you get ex is greater than equal to lambda times probability of a. So probability of a is less than equal to ex by lambda, and we have proved our inequality. Right? So here in the first inequality, we use the fact that x is non-negative. In the second inequality, we use the fact that you're looking only at the set where x is greater than lambda, and you get this. So the probability of a is less than equal to the expectation of x divided by lambda. Now the question comes what x to use, because our original set is in terms of mod Sn. So you could use mod Sn or you could use something else. Well, we need something which will give a bound which is useful in our big plan, right? You need a bound whose sum is less than infinity. And also you, of course, you need a bound which you can actually calculate, otherwise you cannot carry through the program. So here I'm going to take a leap and tell you what bound actually works. So you have to trial and error will tell you what works, but here I'm going to just give you the answer right away. And what works is applying the bound to Sn to the power of 4. Okay, sorry. So we are going to apply the bound to Sn to the power of 4, because that will give us a bound which will actually be summable, whose sum will be less than infinity. So Sn, remember, is R1 to Rn, where each R1 is plus 1 if it is heads, minus 1 if it is tails. So if you take the fourth power, then you get various terms like this. So you get R1 4, R2 4, Rn 4. Then you get some terms where, there you have two squares, 1 square 1 cube, 1 no power, first power 1 cube, 2 first power 1 squares, and of course one term where you have all first powers. So dot 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 is not an infinite sum. Basically, there's some finite number of terms like this, each of these terms. Okay. So here is the reason why I introduce auxiliary R variables, because now when I take the expectation, I can use the linearity of expectations to say that the expectation will also sum over like this. So I just take the expectations. So expectation of Sn4 will be expectation of Ri, R14, R4 plus this expectation plus this expectation and so on. And what about the individual expectation of the Ri? Easy to calculate. It's plus 1 if the choice is heads, minus 1 if the choice is tails. So ERI is 0, right? Because it's plus 1 into half plus minus 1 into half, that's 0. ERI square, sorry, the bracket is wrong. ERI square is equal to 1 because it's plus 1 square into half minus 1 square into half. So that's going to be 1, because minus 1 square is also going to be 1. Ri cube is again going to be 0 because plus 1 cube is 1, minus 1 cube is minus 1. Ri 4 is going to be 1 because plus 1 to the power of 4 is 1, minus 1 to the power of 4 is 1. So I have the expectation of the individual Ri, and now I'm going to use that to calculate the expectation of this Sn to the power of 4. Now the problem is what about to do about this product terms. So here I'm going to use a result from elementary probability that I assume you know, where if you have independent random variables, then the expectation of the product is the product of expectations. So then I can break each of this up. It's ER1 square, ER2 square, ER1, ER2 cube, etc. etc. Okay. So this we know that if x and y are independent, expectation of xy is the expectation of x times the expectation of y. Now once you do that, then only the first two lines will remain, because from the third line onwards, you always have something like expectation of R1, which is 0. Then whatever it multiplies doesn't matter. The line is going to disappear. So ER1 0, whatever it multiplies, I don't care, I have 0. ER1 0, whatever it multiplies, I don't care, I have 0. So you are left with just the first term and the second term. Okay. Now something we left out. So first term, how many terms? N terms, right? Second term, how many terms? I am going to claim 3n into n minus 1 terms. I will just give you an argument why that many terms. But if that is so, ER1 4 is 1, ER2 4 is 1. So all this expectation together contributes n. ER1 square is 1, ER2 square is 1. So the product is 1. And I am claiming that the 3n n minus 1 terms. So total is 3n square minus 2n, which is less than equal to 3n square. Okay. Fine. Any questions? Okay, why 3 and n minus 1 terms? Because we are looking at, so when you say Sn to the power of 4, then basically you have R1 to Rn into R1 to Rn into R1 to Rn into R1 to Rn. And you form the product by taking one term from each bracket and multiplying. So you are looking at things like Ri, Rj, Rk, Rl, but Ij, Kl are not distinct. You have basically two indices, each of them repeated twice. So it's a problem in permutation combination. You can do it in different ways. The way I found easiest was that you can pick the first position in n ways. So the first index can be chosen in any which way. There are n ways of doing that. Now this first index has to be repeated somewhere. So it can be repeated in the second position or the third position or the fourth position. So there are three ways of repeating it. After the first index has been repeated, the other two indices have to be the same. So there is no choice of position left. The only choice left is that what is the index. It has to be distinct from the first, So there are n minus ways of doing that. So you multiply the possibilities of each of these choices. So you get n into 3 into n minus 1. So that becomes 3n n minus 1. That is why you have 3n n minus 1 terms of the kind r1 square, r2 square. There will be another r1 square, r2 square will occur again and again. So it will not just occur once. Then you'll have other terms occurring again and again. So you'll have r2, r4 square and so on. So that's how I got this 3n n minus 1. But all said and done, so you can try this permutation combination calculation in your own way, or you can try it SN4 for some small n and see how it works. But ultimately, we know that E SN4 is less than equal to 3n square. Now we are going to apply that. So now we are interested in bounding the probability that Sn mod Sn is greater than n by k. So if mod Sn is greater than n by k, then Sn to the power of 4 is greater than equal to n by k to the power of 4. I apply the Markov inequality, so that's less than equal to E Sn to the power of 4 upon n by k to the power of 4, right? Because the Markov inequality said that x greater than equal to lambda, the probability is less than equal to Ex by lambda, x had to be non-negative, which is why I took the fourth power, because the fourth power is going to be non-negative. So it becomes less than equal to Esn power 4 n by k to the power of 4. I actually haven't even calculated Esn to the power of 4, but I have an upper bound from the last slide that it's less than equal to 3n square. So it's less than equal to 3n square by n by k to the power of 4. You rearrange, it's 3k power 4 by n square. So the important thing is that if you take an is equal to 3k4 by n square, then I know that p akn is less than equal to an, because the left hand side in this whole displayed calculation is probability of akn, because akn is exactly the set where mod Sn is greater than n by k, and that's less than equal to 3k4 by n square. And if you add this up over n, then the sum is finite. This is the basic result from analysis. I will prove it in a second, that if you sum up 1 by n square, then the sum is finite. And so all our objectives in a grand plan are satisfied, that you have been able to bound akn in a way that the an sum to sum to a finite number. So the tail sums go to 0. So bkn limits to 0, and you feed that back and you get pg complement is equal to 0. So we have actually proved the strong law of large numbers. So we chain together a lot of inequalities, and the main job, see, ultimately you have to say that some deviation is not going to grow too large. So the main job was done by the Markov inequality, and it had to bring in independence, because we could not calculate this without using independence here. Because see, something like the law of large numbers is not going to be valid if you don't have independence. If the different random variables can conspire together to push in the same direction, then they need not come back to their mean. So independence has to be used somewhere, and it was used in this step. And ultimately, we were able to prove the strong law of large numbers. Okay. Just a short proof in case you haven't seen it, that the sum of the reciprocal squares actually converges. So it's a fun proof. So you are trying to look at the limit of 1 plus 1 by 2 square plus 1 by 3 square plus 1 by 4 square. The trick is to group this term. So take 1 as it is. Now 1 by 2 square, 1 by 3 square. So 3 is bigger than 2. So 1 by 3 square is going to be less than equal to 1 by 2 square. So you repeat 1 by 2 square twice, because 1 by 2 square is definitely less than 1 by 3 square is definitely less than 1 by 2 square. Then you took 1 by 4 square and repeat it 4 times. So 1 by 4 square comes as 1 by 5 square. 1 by 4 square comes as 1 by 4 square. 1 by 5 square is less than 1 by 4 square. 1 by 6 square is less than 1 by 4 square. 1 by 7 square is less than 1 by 4 square. Fine. Now you take 1 by 8 square and repeat it 8 times and so on. So then you get a sum 1 plus 2 by 2 square, 4 by 4 square. It's 1 plus half plus 1/4. But that's just a GP with starting term 1 and the common factor half. And we know how to sum a GP that's equal to 2. So now we know that the limit of this sum of reciprocal squares is going to be less than equal to 2. So it's going to be finite. So again, we have avoided calculation and we just have a bound. So we have obtained a bound which says that this will not run away to infinity. It will be finite. So it will suit our purpose here. That if you take an, because k will go out of this sum, because we are summing over n. So whatever k is, we don't care. When you sum over n, 1 by n square will sum to something less than infinity, and we will have achieved success. So any questions on this? Okay, so we have proved the strong law of large numbers. Just to mention, well, there is also a weak law of large numbers, which actually is easier to prove. We say a sequence of random variables converges in probability to a random variable y. If for any epsilon, the probability that xn minus y mod is more than epsilon, that probability goes to 0 as n goes to infinity. So just focus on the difference between this and the kind of convergence we had in the strong law. So in the strong law, we said that for almost all, so in probability or measure theory, whenever you say almost all or almost every, we mean that on a set apart from an exceptional set of measure zero. So you may have some exceptions, but the exceptions are measure zero. Apart from that, for all outcomes, the convergence holds. So for all sequence of tosses, right, the proportion of heads will converge to half, except for some exceptional tosses, which together have a measure zero. Right? Whereas in convergence probability, you are not saying that convergence will happen for any sequence at all. Convergence may not happen sequence by sequence, but the deviations will be less than epsilon for a shrinking probability of sets, right? So each sequence may keep deviating and jumping around, but as n becomes larger, the proportion of sequence which deviate is going to become smaller and smaller, right? So it's a weaker result because it doesn't tell you that along each sequence you'll get convergence, right? That's why it's called the weak law of large numbers. But the weaker result, the good thing about weaker results is that they're easier to prove. So the weak law of large numbers is useful because in many cases where establishing the strong law may be hard, you may still be able to produce a weak law of large numbers. And the weak law also is a truth theorem. And if you have been able to prove the strong law, you will be able to prove the weak law. Right? So the proof of that is in the last slide, but I think we have done a lot of proofs today anyway. So I'm not going to discuss that. You can take this as an exercise and look at it. Okay, so that's what I was planning for today. So now if you have any questions, comments. So what is it that we are planning to do next week? So we have 3 more lectures. So the first thing we'll do is integration, that we took mathematical expectation of random variables, but actually we have not defined these terms. Or if you want to integrate a function, we said that measure theory will give you a more powerful uh, concept of integral than what you do in your elementary integration in school or college. So we are going to define the notion of integral, which comes to us from measure theory. And we'll see actually that it has some good properties. That's going to be lecture number 4. Lecture number 5 will look at conditional probabilities and how measure theory allows us to get a sensible theory of conditional probabilities and how that can be used to model accumulation of information. So in economics, often we are thinking of information accumulating over time, or we are thinking of different agents with different information. So how the theory of conditional probabilities allows us to model that situations. And in the final lecture, lecture 6, we'll talk about how measure theory can be used to model competitive equilibrium in economies with a continuum of agents. So now you don't have a discrete set of agents, you don't have a finite set, you have a continuum. So how do you model aggregate demand equilibrium in those cases? So that's the agenda for next week. Please feel free to write if you have any feedback, questions, and so on. So anything you'd like to say now, I will just stop the recording.